Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. How people feel about what's happening in their lives matters politically. Just think, for example, of how many white people respond with anger and fear when people who experience racism challenge that racism in militant ways. But then what about how people deal with loss and grief? Sarah Jaffe has written a new book that's focused on grief and society today from a radical political perspective, and I'm happy to welcome Sarah as the guest on today's episode of Victor's Children. So Sarah, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your new book and also about the new podcast you're co-hosting?
Hi, yeah, I'm Sarah. I'm a journalist who's been doing this for about 15 years now. And From the Ashes is my third book. And as you said, it's about grief. It's about a world on fire. It's about how we are trying to get through the day to day. And yeah, just for fun, and sort of related to the feeling of taking feelings seriously politically, a friend and I just started a left-wing advice podcast called Heart Reacts. So if you can't get enough of listening to me and you want me to solve all your problems, you can check that out too.
Thanks. So loss and grieving are part of human experience in every society. Mm-hmm. But the question of what we actually lose and how we experience loss and how we grieve, if we grieve what we've lost, all that varies across history and across societies. So I'm interested if you could tell us about how you see the experience of loss and consequently, at least potentially, of grieving that people are dealing with today, at least, and we'll narrow it like in the United States, so-called Canada, and other advanced capitalist countries, because of course, globally, these things would be experienced differently.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the thing that made me write this book, obviously, was an experience of grief in my own life. And then I started to sort of see grief everywhere in all of the subjects I was covering as a journalist, all of the movements that I was seeing, involved in, et cetera. And that made me think like, this is actually sort of the simultaneous experience of being in these movements and also trying to find space for my own sort of upheaval, my own loss it made me think. And my therapist would tell you that I like to intellectualize my problems. So here we go. I wrote a book about it. But it really did make me think that, particularly in sort of late capitalist Western culture, that like grief is really foreclosed. Right. I remember growing up on the, speaking of Canada, the Anne of Green Gables books and these, stories about people who would wear their like widows, their like mourning clothing for like years on end. And like, if they took it off before a year was up, that was just like unpardonably fast. And like that culture is gone. Right. If you can get 2 days off from work to go to a funeral, you're lucky. And so with it made me think about like, why is it actually that a capitalist society that after all sort of in the aggregate can't really care about any one of our lives can be challenged effectively by people who are grieving? And obviously the sort of George Floyd uprising in the midst of the COVID pandemic was this really powerful moment of these two collective griefs, right, intersecting with each other. Stephen Thrasher in his book points out that George Floyd died with COVID. Right, that was not what killed him. Obviously, a police officer killed him, but that he had tested positive for COVID. And so you think about that, right? You think about the many ways that this society kills people, and it kills some people, i.e. Black men, a lot more often than others, but it doesn't value any of our lives. And I talked to 2 different factory workers in the course of writing this book who had stories about somebody, getting sick or having a heart attack on the line next to them and just being basically yanked out of the way in order to keep the line going. And that was sort of a metaphor for how the whole thing works, right? That like, the whole system had to keep churning. Some of us got to stay home during COVID, but mostly the thing had to keep churning. And that meant that a lot of people were just going to be forced to risk their lives. And so if the system cannot grieve by sort of definition, what kind of power can we have by insisting on grief?
So the question that bubbles up in my mind about this in response to what you've said. Oh, by the way, I should just mention, you mentioned Stephen Thrasher's book. So that's The Viral Underclass.
Yes,
for
it
people
is.
who might not have heard of it. But any thoughts about how what we're living with in terms of grief in society today is different than it was, say, 20 years ago or 50 years ago?
I think, okay, that I don't think I wrote about it specifically this way in the book, but that makes me think about Will Davies's formulation of sort of punitive neoliberalism being the phase of the thing that we're in now. So it's no longer making promises to us that anything will get better, right? The brief delusion around Kamala Harris aside, the system is not promising us things will get better. I'm talking to you from England, where, the Labour Party has just taken over and is basically declaring austerity 2.0. They are, even the liberal parties, and it pains me to say anything positive about Bill Clinton or Tony Blair, but when they came into power, they sort of promised us something. And remember Bill Clinton famously saying, "I feel your pain," right after he went back to Arkansas to execute Ricky Ray Rector, because he did not, in fact, feel anyone's pain. But that, the pretense is off, is what I would say to that, right? The pretense that there's something positive for most of us in this system is just gone. And it's just sort of naked coercion and cruelty. And the only people who sort of still believe in the system are the people who are embracing that cruelty. And again, right before you turn the recorder on, we were also talking about how there have been racist riots across Britain in the last couple of weeks. They seem to have slowed down because it turns out most people in this country aren't fascist, which is great. But you see people who are delighting in the idea that they might get to take out their anger, aggression, whatever, on people who are worse off than they are. Set fire to a hotel that's hosting refugees, and that itself is, I think it's part of the whole thing. I toward the end of the book, in the conclusion, I write a little bit about the rise of the far right and fascism and how it's, on a very basic level, a movement that not only does not grieve, but actually glories in the death and misery of others. And whether or not we're talking full on, how quickly am I going to go for Godwin's law here? Whether we're talking the Holocaust or just what's going on in Gaza right now, there is this really horrific and sort of depraved glory and cruelty that I see in so many places right now. And it's not only are the lives of, say, Palestinians rendered ungrievable, but anything you do to them is justified. And this is where we get the horrible spectacle of the Knesset debating whether rape is okay or actually great. There was no it's bad, actually, we shouldn't do that. There was just well, this is sometimes permissible, or we should do this to everyone. That's the level we're on. So I think in a world that has become more and more callous to just the awful things that are happening every day, we're seeing this new wave of not only not grieving the losses, but celebrating them.
Can you get more specific about ways that contemporary society gets in the way of the grieving the things that we're losing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mentioned the workplace, which is obviously I am by trade a labor reporter, so that's sort of the place that I start, is talking about the literal limits on our time that the job gives us, right? And one of the things that I realized again when my father died was how time consuming grieving is, and also how it doesn't work on the clock. And again, I'm Jewish. We have a sort of tradition of sitting Shiva for a week, right? And then there's a sort of longer clock of mourning that is ritualized in certain ways. But it immediately was clear to me that it doesn't work on a clock and it doesn't go in stages, right? That you might be fine for the week after the person dies and sort of still be in shock and moving basically through your life like normal. And then 3 months later be completely collapse, it still hits me at times that I do not expect. Turns out writing a book about it will actually not make your feelings go away. It will make them come back at very inconvenient moments, like recording the audiobook or doing interviews about it. And it's the number one thing that capitalism wants from us is our time, right? It extracts our time in the form of labor power, and doing things like having pesky feelings gets in the way of that extraction. So, the first thing that gets foreclosed is your time. But also, I think the way that our time is sort of taken away from us, it makes it hard to experience anything sort of in the moment when you're feeling it, right? Because you've sort of got to work on this clock of, the boss, the job, the manager, the emails at 10 p.m. And then, in a system that is designed to sort of pit us all against each other, it is designed, especially, and again, when we're talking about sort of waves of neoliberalism, if you conceive of neoliberalism, as several people have written, as sort of the project of destroying the social solidarity that had been built in a few decades of social democracy, and a few decades of communism. Like, one part of destroying that solidarity is literally destroying the places and spaces that we have to connect with and care about each other. So the Union Hall, I spent a lot of time with people who had been miners in Britain before the miners' strike and before the closing of all but one. There's one mine left in Wales somewhere, and about 100 miners in it. And I, sat down with the president of the union, who basically represents 100,000 retired miners and 100 active miners. And so much of his job was it was like mourning for the dead and fighting for the living. It was fighting to make sure that people who were still alive got their healthcare benefits from the job that was still killing them, even though the job had been gone for 20 years. And on the other hand, going to commemorations of mining disasters and sometimes commemorations of good things like the Durham Miners Gala. And that is something that is, a point of struggle against the world that said we're just going to shut down the mines, and with them, this entire structure of your life, that you are not going to have the Union Hall anymore. You're not going to have the spaces where you socialize, the spaces where you might have held your wedding and your funeral and your child's, birthday party. Like, that's gone. And so when you think of that sort of destruction of those spaces, right, it cuts off our ability to connect and to care. And obviously we know, as people on the left, that kind of connection is important to build solidarity. But it's also just like human beings are like at a very biological level social creatures, right? Like, the World Health Organization says that loneliness is as hazardous to your health as smoking 15 packs of cigarettes, or I don't remember, that's a week or a month. Anyway, it's a lot. It's bad for you to be alone, right? It's bad for us to be isolated and disconnected and only competing with each other. And when we discount things like that, how are the effects of all of this on our lives?
And that's exactly the next thing I wanted to ask you about, was your thoughts on when capitalism gets in the way of our grieving. What is it doing to us as individuals as we go about trying to survive in this social world?
Yeah, I mean, I am, again, I should say I'm not a medical doctor or a therapist or in any way qualified to comment on some of this stuff, but I've done some reading. And, when you think about things that are like loneliness is physical, grief is physical. Like, it gave me heart palpitations and my breath would shorten. And there are people, I spoke to several people who are clinicians of various sorts for this book, and they would say, I will have patients who are grieving and they sort of don't have time for it and they stuff it down, and then they will have flare-ups of autoimmune conditions and, ulcers and things like that, right? That, like, if you don't give it time, it takes it from you. And so on a sort of, bodily level, it takes it from you. And it's interesting because I sort of, one of the arguments that I make very early on in the book, right, is that grief is not work, that there's sort of nothing we can do. Like, people will often say, and this is related to trying to get it done in a certain amount of time, like, well, you need to grieve, as though that like is a clear action, and it's not one, right? I thought, before my father died, that I would, cry a lot and that would be sort of it. And it's like, oh, no, it's so much more complicated than that. So much messier than that. And so, it was the strongest experience I had ever had of the way that, like, the system we live in is just not built for human life, because it was just like, I had to work. I'm a freelancer. So luckily I had, and have like a group of editors that I work for regularly who, would just reach out to me with assignments and I would say, cool, yes, I can write about the Janus decision. Cool, yes, I can write about, whatever. I think I wrote about grad students organizing around sexual harassment, and it was not like any of these things are not interesting to me, but I didn't pitch anything for a while. And I just was like incredibly reactive. And yeah, it was next to impossible to do a good job at my job. And that again, it radiates outward, right? My job, probably no one dies if I do my job badly. At the most, public service case I can make for my work is my job is to tell people about things that are going on in the world that they might not know about. And the way I do my job, it's mostly to tell people about organizing that people are doing that they might be able to emulate and learn from. What if you're a doctor? You're a nurse, you're an ambulance driver, right? And you are not getting to rest and take care of yourself. Like these things actually have effects, right? When we are not cared for. And that goes for all sorts of things, not just grieving, obviously, right? But I've been lucky enough, into my 40s to not have any real serious illnesses. But like, if I live long enough, they'll come for me if I don't die in some other spectacular fashion. So these moments when you're like, oh, I actually can't do life as usual. It's actually impossible for me to do life as usual. Not because there's something I need to do to grieve, but just because like that's what it does. That really, it disrupts everything in a different way. And, and then I would see these sort of moments of like spectacular collective grieving, like the George Floyd uprising, like before that, because this was in 2018, after Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore. You had all these people, rising up. And part of what they're doing is insisting on the value of this person's life, right? Literally, when we say Black Lives Matter, right? Yeah. And so claiming people as grievable, right? And saying like it actually mattered that this person was taken away from us. And doing that sort of collectively and in public and across a lot of lines that people often think are uncrossable in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of location. And it suddenly struck me that like, right, like the thing that grief made impossible, which is like going about your life in a normal fashion, maybe it makes other things possible.
If we step back and look at it at a different scale, we think about, more and more losses that aren't being grieved and what that's doing on a larger scale in society. So not just as individuals, but how it's playing out
right
politically in on a larger scale way. What do you think about that, given the writing and the thinking you've been doing on this?
Yeah, I mean, we were already talking about the pogroms in Britain and right, like on the one hand, there's the cruelty of a society that only values accumulation and not what our lives are actually like, that we just see that becoming so much more obvious and horrific all the time. And like capitalism's never been nice, but it feels like we just have more and more mask off moments these days, doesn't it? And I think so if you think back to like the start of the thing, right? And if we're going back to like the enclosures and a moment of forcing people off the land out of social bonds that they had developed into new ways of living, into new ways of dying. I read sort of late in the game of writing this book, Peter Linebaugh's The London Hanged, which is just such an incredible book. My friend Lydia Pelo-Hobbs, who is also quoted in my book several times, Lydia was like, it's a banger. And I was like, it is a banger, which you would not think a book about like executions in London at the, turn to capitalism would be a banger, but it sure is. And I was so struck by, this depiction of what the world was like in the transition of all of these people who had been disrupted from their ways of life and what they did to survive and what the state did to them in turn. It was right, capital punishment and the punishments of capital is his phrase. And And then we had a long, long period of struggle of making the thing somewhat livable that resulted in, maybe say 100 years of like a halfway decent life for some chunk of the world's population, mostly white men, and some of their wives. Like, we're watching that sort of be chipped away. And of course, even in the middle of that, we had, fascism. So like, even a few decades of social democracy really were, broken up by some of the worst people in the world. So again, like the thing's never been nice, but it's at this point killing the planet in ways that are increasingly obvious. And that, I think, too, is a result of a way of thinking about the world that is just about extraction and accumulation, and not about like, oh, there's a bird. That bird has a right to exist in that tree, and maybe we shouldn't cut it down. And my friend James Meadway really loves to talk about the jellyfish that are invading nuclear plants now, because this is very funny. But it is, these moments, or like the orcas attacking yachts is my favorite, and they show up in the book because I couldn't resist the orcas. But these moments where we sort of anthropomorphize, nature fighting back against us. But like, look, man, we know we've like fried the planet, and by we, I don't mean most of us haven't had the choice, but and this is where I go with Jason Moore and Andreas Malm and some others and talk about the Capitalocene rather than the Anthropocene, even though it's clunky. But, I think there's a reason that is not simply humans are like this, that we're setting the planet on fire. And yeah, when we turn everything into sort of so much raw material for the accumulation rather than life around us, not to sound too much like a hippie, like, well, this is where we end up. We end up with no value of anything. And I always do these interviews and I just end up quoting a bunch of other smart people. So like I'm thinking about like Raj Patel's book, The Value of Nothing, right? And how we just have a society that knows the value of basically nothing. And the number one thing that it does not, value, again, is sort of our lives, our literal existence.
So the book you've written is about grief, but I also want to bring up another aspect of our emotional experience in the world today that I think is really politically important, and that's anxiety. Because we're seeing how global heating and just living in a world where so many things are getting harder and people have to deal with those challenges with less support or no support, especially beyond their immediate families. And then you have the rise of the far right. So it's not difficult to see how all these things are fueling anxiety about the future, which is fear of what we may lose.
Right. Exactly.
So do you have any thoughts about where anxiety fits in the picture?
Well, I say this as somebody who has recently given up caffeine because it was like kicking my anxiety into overdrive. Yes, I have some thoughts. And I do sort of write about this in the same place when I'm writing about climate grief. I'm like, there's sort of climate grief and there's climate anxiety. Because for some people, the apocalypse is already here. I live, when I'm not in London, in New Orleans, which is a place that has already, been, halfway flattened by a hurricane in 2005, which is almost, next year is going to be 20 years since Katrina, which is bonkers to me. But, so I, when I was writing the climate grief chapter, I wanted to talk to people who had sort of already experienced apocalypse, and at the same time to say that like for a lot of us, it is this like anticipatory thing. And also that like grief made my anxiety way worse. And I mean, again, like the physical feeling of anxiety, like the reason that I'm off the caffeine is the literal heart palpitations and like all of that stuff. And again, I'm constantly thinking these days about how physical all of these emotions are, right? Like how sort of physically connected humans are to each other and how we process emotions sort of in groups collectively, right? And I think, even as socialists who would argue that things are necessarily collective, we don't think enough about how like literally we need each other. Anyway, that's a sidebar on the anxiety question. But yeah, like is anxiety the sort of number one affect of this period of time? I guess it would depend on where you live, right? And what you have been through already. I think in a similar way to the discussions that several people have had about like Palestinians don't have post-traumatic stress disorder because there's no post to the traumatic stress, right? It's just ongoing. And, yeah, are we living in the aftermath or are we living in the moment before the bomb drops? And sometimes if you are in Gaza right now, you're living in both. And the rest of us, are watching on our cell phones. And, how do we function like normal in a world where we know these things are happening? I don't know. I've not been doing a very good job of it. And I have a book to sell. So like, it's all of these are sort of morbid symptoms of a world where we're disconnected from each other, where we're forced to sort of scramble for everything that we need, and where we know that like we don't have a lot of control, right? And again, like stress and anxiety and post-traumatic stress and trauma and all of it have physical effects. And so we're all sort of, stumbling our way through this world that is breaking us on so many levels. And like, it just feels, again, really real these days to think about that. Like, how do we actually manage to come together and take care of each other and also do like the strategic work of organizing, which is like not real easy to do when you are, having an anxiety attack, when you are grieving, when you are depressed, right? Like I just did an event with Hannah Proctor and her wonderful book Burnout, which is about, the emotional experience of political defeat. Such a good book. Hannah's fantastic. And yeah, and just thinking about like, right, like defeat is a form of grieving. It is something that we have to pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and try again, as Aaliyah would have it. And like, that just gets harder each time you get your butt kicked, resilience is a word that like several people that I talked to for this book were just like having no more of that term, Joe Banner was having no more of that term. Zia Americano was having no more of that term. It was just like, we are done being resilient. Like, what the hell, Is resilient to do more with less all the time, right?
Yeah, no, I completely agree that ways we have to find to care for each other, that kind of connectedness that we need in order to be able to engage in the building of solidarity,
Yeah.
and all the other kinds of things that are involved in fighting back.
Yeah.
Which perhaps takes us to the way that different kinds of political forces are responding to the grief and loss that are being caused by capitalism today. So let's start with Psy, Kamala Harris, Justin Trudeau, Keir Starmer, right? The liberal or social liberal, as some people would say, political forces. What do they offer when it comes to a response to these things? You touched on this a little bit earlier by contrast.
No. I think it's really interesting. I've been talking with Sarah Marcus, who also wrote a book about political disappointment, about the sort of the like hope and change 2.0 of the Kamala Harris campaign, right? That like, oh, we've gotten rid of Biden and now it's all going to be great. And like Trump is losing it. And so definitely Kamala's just going to like cruise to victory. And I'm just like, I have met America, so there's that. And then there's also just the fact that, like I was talking about Keir Starmer earlier, like Kamala Harris is also promising us nothing. She's trying to like wrap up the uncommitted delegates who were, of course, organizing uncommitted votes as protests over what's going on in Gaza and the fact that the US is paying for it. That they are trying to sort of lock up those delegates now to avoid having any sort of mess at the convention, which is coming up very soon. As we're recording this, it will have happened by the time I think people hear it. So, you will know better than I do, dear listener, what actually went down. But that attempt to like promise nothing but sell us like shallow, what was it Sarah Palin called it when it was Obama? It was like that hopey changey stuff, right? Like, Sarah Palin did not have a point on much, but like looking back on it, I'm kind of like the hopey changey stuff, the thing that they are selling us is not being Donald Trump and not being Rishi Sunak, not being Nigel Farage, right? Like those are very low bars to cross. My dog could have crossed them, Yes, you were not Donald Trump. Great. What are you promising us? And I wrote a piece about Keir Starmer after the election here in Britain, and his sort of pose of seriousness, because I find seriousness a really annoying political sort of valence that people try to evoke. And it was just like, yeah, he sort of won over the liberal punditocracy and had an easier go of it than Jeremy Corbyn did, which is, it's a low bar. And the seriousness that he was, promising is basically like the willingness to make hard choices, which is once again just to punish the poor, right? To do austerity again, to not give us anything, to tell people that they can't have nice things and we just have to sort of suck it up and eat our porridge or whatever it is, right? They're just promising us more misery, frankly. And it's tiring. It's tiring to watch it sort of happen over and over again. And just like, I'm tired of being Cassandra over here yelling like these people are not your friends and they're not going to help you. And it's a popular meme that's gone around a little bit. It's like, is Kamala Harris Brad? Is Tim Walz my dad? Is the American Empire my community? Like, you're just like, guys, we know better than this. I thought we knew better than this. But, relief is a powerful feeling, right? I remember when Biden won in 2020, right? And going like, oh, relief. It wasn't like happiness. It was just like, okay, the worst thing has been averted for now. And so I talk about in the book, I refer to it as kind of centrist melancholia, right? Taking from Walter Benjamin and from many other wonderful thinkers, including Wendy Brown and Jody Dean and Rodrigo Nunes, who have talked about left melancholia and how it operates or doesn't operate. But I think at this point, the thing I'm much more worried about most of the time is just that the centrists are just stuck in like, you can't have nice things. I am your dad and I'm going to tell you to eat your broccoli, porridge, broccoli, whatever.
If you're lucky, you get broccoli.
If you're lucky, you get broccoli. Exactly. And, and that's just the pose, and that they're going to be in complete denial of the fact that like, making sure that people's lives don't get better is an excellent recipe for riots, explosions, people voting for all sorts of, again, on the one hand, the far right, on the other hand, the far left. And that they are contributing to a situation where they have less power by sort of insisting on not doing anything with the power that they have. It was like Joe Biden, when he was still campaigning, was like, elect me and we'll codify Roe versus Wade. And I was like, my dude, you're president right now. You're literally telling me we can do it if we reelect you, but not if you are president right now. You can't find a way to make it happen. Why should I believe that you can find a way to make it happen in a second term? Like, I can't get a legal abortion right now I can in London, but like I can't in, Louisiana. I live in the place that is the furthest away from a safe and legal abortion in the United States of America at this moment, hoping that Florida changes that very soon. Come on, Florida. Not a thing I say very often. And so like this sort of trap of like, nothing can get any better. How dare you challenge us? Head in the sand, like nostalgia for, I don't know, Blairism is just like, every year it feels less just like insulting and more like I don't like using the term gaslighting for politics because I think politicians just lie to us. But it like the delusion of it is really striking. You just like you must know that like the more sort of, offshore oil licenses you give and fracking you approve and whatever, right? That like you are literally setting the planet on fire. You are not making people's lives better. You are just ensuring that the next time around they don't want to vote for you. And yeah, what is that? It is just a recipe for things continuing to sort of ratchet down worse and worse.
So as things continue to ratchet down worse and worse, the hard right and the far right, of course, are relating to this and to all the experiences of loss that people are having. So do you want to pick up on some of the things you said earlier and maybe say a few things more about the way that they respond to that experience, to that emotional quality of life today?
Who does? The
right?
Yeah. I mean, I think they, many years ago now, in 2016, I went to Indiana as a project of the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, which is Barbara Ehrenreich's baby. And we really miss Barbara right now. And I went to meet Tom Lewandowski, who was actually a friend of Barbara's, who was the head of the Central Labor Council in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And we talked about, Trump providing people with like emotional representation because they're not getting actual representation, right? Trump is not going to make their lives any better. But they get to feel something. And that feeling is sort of not taken seriously by certainly liberals, but also I think, too many on the left at our peril. Like without any promise of your life getting better, people will take consolations where they can. And sometimes those consolations are attempting to set a migrant hostel on fire. Sometimes those consolations are running your vehicle into a crowd of, Black Lives Matter protesters. Sometimes they are taking a gun and, Kyle Rittenhouse is free, these are the sort of really horrific consolations that fascism offers people. We're not going to make your life better, but at least you can kill some Black people. Which, by the way, has kind of been the promise of the US as a project since the beginning. You can kill some Native people, you can kill some Black people, you can have some slaves. And that's going to be the thing that makes up for the fact that we're not going to do anything for you either. At least somebody else is going to have it worse off than you. And you get to like explicitly sort of both accumulate from them if you are, lucky enough to own slaves, or just basically, feel good about yourself. And I think of like lynching videos, or not videos because they didn't have video most of the time, although we've got lynching videos now these days, but photos of people, gathering and having a big old party as they murder someone,
Postcard.
That this is not new. This is not an invention of punitive neoliberalism, sadly. It's as old as the system itself. And the system itself was, at many points in time, very just like nakedly obvious about its, desire to wipe out entire populations in order to take what they had. So I'm really cheery today. I actually do talk to people about some amazing organizing in this book too. I don't want to say that like, read this book and you'll want to like yeet yourself into a river. Like, no, I think that, recognizing how bad things are is sort of necessary in order to move forward. And that's why, we talked about the pogroms in Britain. And then, the next few days, like thousands of people came out to say, absolutely not on our watch. And there were like tiny handfuls of Vash who actually dared to show up because there were, thousands, like something like 5,000 people on the streets of Walthamstow, and there is, I still think, a lot of understanding that we need each other among most people, even if, electoral politics is not giving them a lot of opportunities to show that.
Which takes us to the question of how, people like the ones who listen to this podcast, people on the radical left, how we should be relating to the forms of loss and grieving that people are experiencing. And in the book, which I should say, I didn't say this earlier, it's an extraordinary book. And people really should listen to it. You write in the book that a socialism or communism worth the name should aim for expanding emotional freedom as well as material freedom. So can you pick up on that and offer some thoughts for the left about how we should be relating to these, especially working class experiences of loss and grief?
Yeah, I think that when I think about, again, as I was talking about earlier, the way that you have so little time to feel what you feel. Imagine again the guy on the, assembly line and your colleague next to you gets sort of yanked out of the way so that they can just put in another live body to keep the feed going. Like, how do you even like feel anything about that, right? And I think, I'm obviously sort of referencing obliquely in that line, like Marx's writings on the realm of freedom, right? That the realm of freedom can only exist when the realm of necessity has been, taken care of, right? So you can actually feel and live all of your experiences, good and bad, right? Grief and joy and love and pleasure and, relaxing on a Thursday evening. If you don't have pressing needs to see to that moment, right? You can only actually experience the rest of things if you're literally not worried about where you're going to sleep that night and what you're going to eat, where the rent is coming from, right? The sort of line from was it the Gilets jaunes? Some of these protests. It was like, the climate people worry about the end of the world and we worry about the end of the month. And the response to that from organizers was like, end of the world, end of the month, same fight, right? How do you experience anything? Like to go back to your comment about anxiety, right? Like what I think about anxiety and depression, both are ways of not feeling. They are things that sort of take the place of actually experiencing your feelings. The only thing you can experience is the anxiety or is the depression. You feel sort of nothing else. And yeah, what's like one great way to handle people's anxiety is like make sure their needs are met. So it's not like, oh, I'm saying that we should, turn every organizing meeting into a therapy session. But what I'm actually saying is that like this is related to the question of meeting people's material needs. And also that, again, that it's really hard to do good organizing if you are completely traumatized, if you are grieving, if you are, again, worrying about where you're going to sleep that night. And people do, resist under incredibly horrific conditions. Again, we're seeing this in Gaza right now. But also, like, the resistance is much more effective if people are actually taken care of. And the movements that I write about in this book and a lot of the organizations that I'm writing about, the tenants union in Minneapolis that I'm just obsessed with. And I'm going to butcher the Spanish name. I'm sorry. It's Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia. It's Tenants United for Justice. And they organize sort of like big landlord by big landlord. But within that space, they're also advocating for social housing. They have won a set of buildings away from a bad landlord and actually have a housing cooperative now. And in those spaces, those are spaces where people's needs get met. And again, like it's really hard to do anything if you have rats and black mold in your apartment, right? But once you actually have a place you can go to talk about the rats and black mold, particularly with housing stuff, there's a lot of shame involved, also with debt, right? And so there is an emotional barrier to break through just to get to the organizing, to say, particularly for a lot of tenants in these, these big landlords who deliberately prey on low-income people, immigrants, students in some cases, and then they say, well, it's your fault that there are rats. It's your fault that there's mold. It's your fault you're dirty, And there's a lot of shame in that. It can be really hard to be like, yeah, I've got rats in my apartment. I've got bed bugs. Ooh, landlord won't fix it. But then you find out everybody who, rents from this landlord who owns, 200 buildings across the city or whatever. And then you're like, oh, it's not me. It's that guy. And the transformations that are possible because of that. It's not easy to do that work without taking seriously people's emotional reality. It's not easy to organize without taking people's needs into account. The story that I go back to a lot, and I one of these workers is in the book too, is the people who got Amazon to the bargaining table in the US the first time were a group of immigrant workers from Somalia and East Africa in Minneapolis with the Aoud Center, which is a worker center in the East African community. And they were bargaining about prayer time. They were not bargaining about money. They were bargaining around prayer time. They were bargaining around dignity and what makes them feel fully human. And that anybody who's done any labor organizing or tenant organizing or really any organizing at all will tell you is like, these are the issues that get people going. These are the issues that get people mobilized, right? What makes people feel dignified? It's not wage labor. Sorry, y'all. But that was the last book.
Thank you so much for this. And people will find in the show notes a link to From the Ashes, Grief and Revolution in a World on Fire, and also Sarah Jaffe's website where you can read about Sarah's other books and other projects.
Yeah.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.